What's that? Yeah, except that right after I called you, I hit a huge snowdrift at about 75 miles an hour. It was significant. I did. I busted through it, but I probably packed a bunch of snow up in my engine. I don't know, but so. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We'll just start with a short prayer, and it's not the Holy Spirit prayer. It's just a very brief prayer. So you might want to chime in because it'll sound familiar, but it ends quick. So in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill our hearts that we may become truly wise and holy. A reading from Matthew chapter 22, which is the parable of the marriage feast. Just an excerpt from that. But when the king came to see the guests, he noticed that a man was there who was not wearing a wedding robe. And he said to him, "Friend, how did you get in here without a wedding robe?" And he was speechless. Then the king said to the attendants, "Bind him hand and foot and throw him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." So this is a parable, of course, so that we know it's not to be taken fully literally at all times. And earlier on in that parable, Christ says he likens the kingdom of heaven to this wedding feast. So he's not necessarily talking about heaven itself, but the kingdom of heaven. So there's many different layers to a parable, and depending on the circumstances and the audience and the message, then it can be treated by everybody differently. But for the context of today's talk, I want to talk a little bit about this wedding gown or this wedding robe that all of these people that were in this kingdom of heaven were supposed to be wearing. And then it develops into something else that then comes back and dovetails in at the end, hopefully. But we'll see when we get there. The external appearance of a person can be a mirror into their soul and into their frame of mind. And so it's very important to keep that in mind as you're around other people, because we are judging people from external appearances, and oftentimes that's that first impression of somebody that can mean a lot and can change a lot of the future events between those people in those situations. But in this case, in this parable, I interpret this to be kind of a glimpse into the man's soul, or maybe his mindset, his frame of mind. It may be the way he holds himself in some cases. It might be the way he dresses, like it is in this parable. It might be the way he speaks. It might be the things that he allows to influence him in such a way that he behaves externally in certain ways. Because there is a depth to this external appearance that goes beyond the surface of the skin or the clothing that you wear. There's something deeper inside that causes somebody to dress a certain way, speak a certain way, hold themselves a certain way. And God didn't create us to walk around with slumped shoulders and downcast eyes and just kind of a beaten down nature. Stalin created people to be like that, but God didn't. So we need to hold ourselves in a certain way to glorify God in the things that we do. So as we look at these things, it causes us to consider the state of our own soul. How do we dress? Do we dress appropriately for the situation? For instance, today driving through snow drifts, I thought I'd dress a little warmer and a little less formal, so I didn't bring my jacket and tie. But on certain circumstances, you would dress certainly differently than you would in other situations. If it was 70 degrees out and a nice day, I probably would have dressed differently for today. But you think about how I walk, how I talk, how I dress, how I behave, because I know that other people are looking at me. And we live in a society today where judging is a four-letter word. We aren't to judge, but that's not the Christian way, and that's not actually reality. We judge everything. If I want to leave the room, I have to judge where the door is so I don't walk into the wall, right? I'm judging things. I'm judging people. If I get stalled on the side of the road and somebody pulls up and offers to help me, but they look like they're going to want to make good judgment calls on that. So we think a lot. And it's a bizarre feeling when you're somewhere where you don't belong. Um, you know, you almost wish somebody would bind you and throw you out sometime. Like, show me the door, get me out of here, because um, it's in, the other reason I think this parable is not necessarily an analogy for heaven and hell or heaven and purgatory is because, again, in this passage, his appearance or his apparel that drew him to be the focal point of this parable. Um, Now, a lot of you guys, and I think a lot of the guys on the video probably remember a television show called MASH. And my wife and I just started rewatching all the MASHes in consecutive order, so maybe that's why it found its way into my talk. But I've always loved MASH, watched it over and over again all the way through college and even into my adulthood because it's so creative and well written. But there's a few characters in there in which their clothing was a major part of their person. So you think about Hawkeye Pierce, the main person in MASH. He would oftentimes dress very sloppy or very inappropriately in order to protest the government or the foolish leadership in the army or the war. And so he intentionally dressed in ways that was disrespectful to his superiors because that was part of his message. Another person in MASH that the way he dressed was important was Klinger. He was protesting, trying to get a Section 8, trying to get kicked out of the army, so he dressed as a woman all the time. There was another character later in the episode. I liked Frank Burns, but Winchester came along in about the fifth, sixth year, I think, of the series, and he was always dressing, like an aristocrat because he came from wealth, and so in him it was his superiority financially and maybe his culture that spoke through him. And then one other guy that I thought of was Colonel Flagg. He was always gung-ho Mr. America, and so he was always impeccably dressed as the military would require, and and then he was just way over the top with his official approach to life. So think about how just in a silly television show, these Hollywood writers who weren't really trying to talk about the wedding feast in the kingdom of heaven, still that kind of got into secular culture in a way that's kind of interesting. And we can see that in many other ways around us in entertainment, in the world, in secular and in religious settings. But one place that we can certainly see this very upfront and personal is in the Mass. So in the Mass, the priest has very specific clothing to wear in the Mass. And so as they get ready for Mass, they have various articles of clothing that they put on, and each of those articles has a prayer that goes with it and a symbolism that goes with it. So you have the amice and the alb and eventually the chasuble. All these things symbolize something that make the way the priest dresses very important. And in fact, when the priest is not dressed as they're supposed to be dressed for Mass, it is scandalous for the average Catholic to see that. So we wouldn't want the priest showing up for Mass in casual clothing, because the vestments and gestures and the words of the priest are extremely important, especially in the context of the Mass. So if the priest's vestments, if his clothing and his words and his actions during the Mass are important, how is it possible that ours couldn't be? I just struggle to think that. I think a lot of us are missing the fact that there's oftentimes only one person dressed up for Mass, and it's the priest, or maybe the altar boys. It might be the lector, sometimes not the lector, the ushers, sometimes not the ushers. So I think that as we go into the highest and most important, really the essence of our being as humans here on earth, where the miracle happens every single time, every Mass that's licitly celebrated, the way that we approach that Mass, and not only in the way that we dress, but certainly in the way that we dress, can be heightened and taken up to another notch. So this can also be in a secular setting, and unfortunately, I think a lot of people treat a secular setting like their work or their Saturday down at Memorial Stadium more intentionally that they treat the Mass. So people are showing up to a Husker football game dressed appropriately in the right colors, in the right clothing for the elements, things like that. But we got a lot of guys that are showing up to Mass wearing golf shorts and sandals, and clearly it's not clicking with us a lot of times. So I think that this is something that we can be a lot more intentional about, and it plays into this idea of just kind of a modest approach to life, an intentional approach to life that is going to dovetail into something that is really a crisis in the church. So if we dress differently for Mass, that's a start. But do we speak differently at Mass? And I think most of us do. It would not be possible for us to hold the same conversations during Mass or use the same language or terminology during the Mass that we use with our buddies sitting around the coffee table or the bar or the television set during the game. And that's good. And I think that if somebody is approaching the Mass and they aren't making a separation of I need to speak and act and dress differently for the Mass, then I think there's a problem for them. Would we show everybody at Mass the last text messages that we sent with our buddy? Would we want people to see that conversation in the context of the Mass? Would we want them to know the types of videos or movies that we're watching for entertainment? Is it mundane stuff that doesn't glorify God? Is it blasphemous? Is it harmful? As we go into the Mass, we use the Mass as our barometer to elevate the rest of our lives, not to take off the world and put on the Mass and then take the Mass off and go back into the world, right? So we allow the graces that we get from the Mass to impact us throughout all the aspects of our life. But it's difficult to do if we don't start making that change on a regular basis as we go to Mass. The way that we speak, the way that we dress, the way that we think, the information that we take in, the influences in our lives, the people that we associate with, all of these things play into this sanctification and this path of holiness that we're all called to. Unfortunately, still a lot of people go to Mass in the same clothing they wear to cocktail parties and sporting events and social events, but it hasn't always been that way. You know, I've seen pictures of guys working on skyscrapers in New York in the 1920s and 1910s and late 1800s, and they're dressed better than a lot of guys are dressed today, 24/7, actually, not just when they're going to Mass, but going to work and things like that. They're wearing actual ties and they're welders. You know, it's like, this is bizarre. But they're dressed in a different way. And, you know, the t-shirt has become kind of the default for most of us. And I love t-shirts. I wear t-shirts all the time with goofy things on them to be funny and stuff. But there is a time and a place for that. And I think that even I take it and make a lot more times and places for it than I should, you know. So instead of being the Hawkeye Pierce and dressing like a slob to protest, maybe we should, you know, be the Catholic man and dress with dignity to elevate. So, also in the past probably century or so, the formality of the Mass and the beauty of our churches, as they've changed to blah, and the actual average dress of the American male has also turned to blah. Catholics have also walked away from the sacraments, and I don't think this is any coincidence. So, you know, from 1964 until now, the CARA, which is the Center for Applied Research in the Apostolate out of Georgetown, they started checking statistics on a lot of different aspects of the Catholic faith. And they started that in 1964, so that's kind of the benchmark that we have. Since that time, we have about half the sacramental marriages in Catholic churches that we had in 1964. We have about half of the baptisms. We have about half of the first communions. We have, I think, way less than half of the confirmations. The interesting thing is that our Catholic population in the U.S. has exploded. So we have millions more people in the United States that say they're Catholic, but we have less than half of what we had in 1964 actually living the Catholic faith. So I just heard a statistic on the radio the other day. It said about 1 in 10 Americans is a former Catholic, and might be 1 in 10 American males is a person that might identify as a Catholic or as having been a Catholic, but doesn't currently practice their faith. So 1 in 10 Americans, or 1 in 10 American males. So we've got an enormous number of men who have stopped practicing the faith, or who have formally left it for another religion. And I think that part of it is you know, the external appearance and the external image that we give to other people around us. So maybe this man who was in the parable and wasn't wearing the appropriate clothing to be in the wedding feast was thrown out for that reason, because he was one of those men who wasn't in cooperation with grace, and he wasn't living in the kingdom of heaven. He was still fully in the world, and so he was cast out and allowed to come back in once he was ready to actually participate in the kingdom of heaven. He was treating the kingdom of heaven like the fallen world, maybe. So just as this man needed to treat the kingdom of heaven with more dignity in the way that he dressed in this case, I think that the Mass needs to be treated with more dignity by the people that actually go to Mass, and the way that we dress is a very visible and extremely simple way to do that, I think. So carelessness in dress and appearance is a sort of contempt for those around you. And so think about MASH, right? Well, that's a quote from St. Ignatius of Loyola. So, Introduction to the Devout Life. St. Ignatius of Loyola wrote centuries ago, carelessness in dress and appearance is a sort of contempt for those around you. So it's like the writers of MASH actually read St. Ignatius, or St. Francis de Sales, which I don't think so. And that was St. Francis de Sales. I might have said St. Ignatius of Loyola. So dressing with dignity and conducting ourselves with dignity is very important. Another Francis de Sales quote from that book is, to an extent, outward neatness represents inward cleanliness. So to dress appropriately for the occasion shows respect for those around you by going on this reasoning. So to dress to an extent, outward neatness represents inward cleanliness. So it might be for work, for hunting, for downhill skiing like today, or cross-country skiing. So you dress differently for that. So how would you dress if you were invited to the governor's mansion tonight? You know, is that differently than your dress now? Certainly. Well, maybe not you. You're wearing a tie. That's good. But yeah, so we would dress differently for a hunting trip than we would to have dinner at the governor's mansion. Now, what if you were invited to the bishop's house, or maybe even to see the Pope? You would certainly dress nicer, right? You would dress nicer. So of all those things, the most important moment in our lives each week, or for some of us every day, is the Mass. So what I've told people for a while, and I wrote a piece on this years ago, when you're going to meet the King, you dress like it, right? So at the Mass, we're meeting the King of the world in the flesh. So we should dress like it. So Nick, an angel drops in and says, "Hail, Nick. The Lord would like to dine with thee tonight," right? You're going to dress up. And that's how angels talk. They just say thee and thy and stuff like that. But they would say that. Yeah, the King's English. So, so you would dress differently, right? You would dress up. So at the end of this parable, Christ says, "Many are called, but few are chosen." And it's almost like it's thrown in there. It's at the very end. He says, "Then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot and cast him into the outer darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. For many are called, but few are chosen." And it's like, if this is heaven, yes, we are all called to be in heaven, but we are also chosen to be in heaven, right? And it's our response to that calling and that offering of the choice that makes the difference. But in this context, it's kind of like that doesn't match up with the fact that this parable might be talking about heaven until you realize, okay, he earlier said this is likened to the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so in the kingdom of heaven, many are called to do things. We have vocations, right? That's what we're called to do. We're called to do that. And if we have received the sacraments, we're called to certain vocations within our faith, within this kingdom of heaven, because now we're in the kingdom of heaven. We're adopted as sons and daughters of God with our baptism. So we come in, we say, yes, I have been called and I have been chosen. I'm going to respond to that call. This guy wasn't responding to the call. He was called and he was chosen, but he rejected it, so he was kind of unchosen, right? He's not done forever, I don't think, in this context, but he's certainly out. So many are called, but few are chosen. You are here today because you've been called, right? You've been called. And the call was strong enough that you came through the snow and the wind to get here today. Even the weather couldn't keep you away. But are you chosen for something specific in your life? And that's what everybody struggles with it. What is my calling? What am I chosen to do? And for some of us, that can change given our roles in life. So as a Catholic man, we are called and chosen for certain things, but those change and maybe some things take priority at times. So we're called maybe for marriage. We have a spouse. Now we've got a very serious calling for that relationship with our spouse. First comes love, then comes marriage, then comes baby in the carriage, right? So now we got children. We add another thing in there, or we go off to the seminary and become a priest. We got a whole spiritual family. And so these things develop. Then maybe become a grandparent, or maybe a spiritual parent to other children, a godparent. We got a lot of different things that we're called to in life. But the fact that we have received the sacraments, we are certainly chosen for holiness. And this holiness has something to do with the way that we're dressed, the way that we carry ourselves, the way that we speak, the information that we take in that impacts the way that we behave. So as chosen people, as not in the Jewish sense of the chosen people, but as chosen people now, as sons and daughters of God, we have to control our tongue. And so I'll get to a verse here in a second that talks a little bit about that. but in the way that we talk, we don't brag, we don't embellish, we don't use foul language. We don't threaten people. There's a certain way that a Christian is supposed to control their speech. Another way that St. Teresa of Avila would oftentimes admit her fault is that we don't engage in idle talk. That when we are talking, we're talking about things that glorify God or draw us or the people that we're with closer to God. And so we just had a presidential experience, and boy, we've got a lot of presidential experiences, but we just had one in which there was a president said, well, that was just locker room talk. I said these things, just locker room talk. The whole nation was appalled because of one man's locker room talk. Wouldn't it be better if we didn't have locker room talk? He was drawn into that because that was the culture that he was in at the time. And maybe because of his personality or other flaws, it just made him prone to say those things, and it was a black mark on him. So we don't want to engage in idle talk. But we also need to be careful about the way that we think. And so we want stimulus and information that comes into us that helps us think on higher levels and not more of the base levels. And all of this plays into modesty. It really does. All of this is not being over the top in anything that we do. To be reserved, to be certainly quiet but dignified in the way that we hold ourselves. It can be in our posture and like I keep on saying, in our dress. But really, as Christian men, we've been chosen to live differently, and sometimes even differently than the other Catholic men that we know right now. So everybody's on a different path within the faith. So there's some guys that are struggling. There's some guys that have fallen back. There's some guys that are way ahead of us. And so we need to be aware of these different steps along this path to our eternal salvation, and realize that we definitely don't want to follow guys off the path or go back with them. We always want to do our best to keep moving forward and not standing still either, right? So this leads to my final point. It's nearly impossible to do this on your own. It's more likely that you're going to start dressing, talking, thinking, and behaving like other guys with whom you associate. So as I kind of worked on this talk, I started on, we just need to do one thing, and that is maybe dress a little more dignified for Mass, and that will impact the whole parish. That will impact the whole culture eventually. It'll certainly impact our own family members, right? So if we take it up a notch, some other guys are going to take it up a notch, and some other families are going to say, how come their dad dresses, in a suit and tie, and he's not up there on the altar? He's just going to Mass like you are, Dad. Maybe it'll raise the bar for a few other guys in the parish, and pretty soon it helps start building that culture of a dignified approach to the Mass that, again, is certainly on the surface. And it may not signify a huge change internally, but it's probably going to over time, right? And if it's not in that person, it's going to be in that person or that person maybe. But as I worked on this more, I got to thinking that it boils down to not my approach on life or my ideas. It boils down to the human nature of all of us, I think. And you've heard the phrase, birds of a feather flock together. So I think there's a crisis in the church today, and I think that crisis is a man crisis. But within the man crisis, I think it's a crisis of friendship more than anything. So it makes friendship and relationship the bullseye of that crisis. So I looked at Sirach 6 in preparation for today. And Sirach 6 has a very interesting passage. It's 6:14 through 17, and it says, "A faithful friend is a sturdy shelter. He that has found one has found a treasure. There is nothing so precious as a faithful friend, and no scales can measure his excellence. A faithful friend is an elixir of life, and those who fear the Lord will find him. Whoever fears the Lord directs his friendship aright, for as he is, so is his neighbor also." And so this kind of points out the fact that, again, birds of a feather flock together. It's, Sirach could have shortened it quite a bit, I suppose, but it was prettier the way he wrote it, right? Matthew Kelly also says, you are who your friends are. I think he says that in probably 42 of his 35 books, you know. So, and if you think about it, in the practice of law, I don't deal with criminal law, but I see these things play out in the justice system. Criminals typically hang out with criminals or victims, you know, but they hang out with those people. People who are addicts hang out with addicts. People who are dishonest hang out with other people who are dishonest. But if you look in the history of the church, you see saints that hang out with saints. Almost every major well-known saint that you can think of had another major well-known saint that they either spent time with and associated with and were friends with, or they were basically pen pals. So Saint John and Saint Teresa of Avila, Saint Maximilian Kolbe, probably had a lot of saints in the monastery with him and the men that he dealt with, and certainly at Auschwitz maybe. But he before I think it was before he became a priest, he stopped and visited. I believe it was Saint Teresa of Saint Therese. I think he stopped and visited No, it wasn't Saint Therese. Yeah, it might have been Saint Therese, but a major saint. And he had just been drawn to her. Saint John Paul II went and visited Saint Padre Pio. Just over and over again, you see this, and you think, okay, so these are friendships. They're very spiritual friendships. They're people that sometimes are peers on the same level, but in some cases, one person was still ascending that path of holiness as they befriended this other person, and they looked up to him and would confer with them and learn a lot from them. So it causes us to think about who our friends are, how they dress, how they act, how they talk, the things that influence their lives, and how important that is. Do they dress up for Mass, or do they go to Mass at all? It's not to be lost that misery loves company, and nearly every man who is in despair or boredom or anguish is either solely alone, in which Satan is certainly standing right next to him in those situations, right, or demons, or he has people around him that are also dealing with those same things. So misery loves company. Birds of a feather flock together. There's a book, and Dr. John Cuddeback, has anybody ever heard of him? He's a professor at Christendom College. And he wrote a book in 2021 called True Friendship, Where Virtue Becomes Happiness. And it's a book that I really want to read now. I just heard him on the radio recently. And so I started looking into some stuff, and maybe that's why I was so influenced to bring kind of friendship into this. But he has a lecture series years ago, and he was quite a bit younger when he gave these lectures. There was a series through Christendom College on true friendship. And I think that's what turned into the book. But what he says is, if we are living our vocation well, we are necessarily living our friendships well. And if we are failing at our vocation, we are necessarily failing in our friendships. And that's, human nature is we're kind of a herding species, right? And we take on the good and the bad from those people around us that either infects or elevates us, right? So if we're doing our friendships well, the other parts of our lives are probably going to go pretty well too. But when we start struggling, you can start looking around at your friendships and say, who am I associating with? And it might not be human friends. It might be things like gambling or pornography or some other sort of addiction. But it can be the people within your life that are dragging you down. So one way to look at how we're doing in our vocation as a man is to look at our friendships, and we begin by looking at those things externally, but then again, more deeply. And so our friends behaving in ways that are modest and dignified, what is their character, what are their interests, are they virtuous, how do they carry themselves, speak, and dress, what are their habits, are their habits good, neutral, or bad, because their habits end up being either their virtues or their vices. And so we don't, here we talk about, in our faith we talk about virtue a lot, but in the real world around us, right, in the secular world, you'll hardly ever hear a discussion about virtue. And so even if it's a self-help guru that's talking to your company in San Diego on the company annual uh, high salesman trip, they're going to come in and they're going to get you all pumped up, and they're going to talk about very Christian things in very empty secular terms, typically. And it's kind of disturbing to see that. So, for instance, you see a lot, even in the legal world now, about when we go to seminars and there's attorneys talking about all the stress of being an attorney and depression and suicide and alcoholism and all these things that come along with the practice of law. They'll talk about the need to meditate. And 105% of the time, it's Eastern mysticism. And it just makes me ill, So I just want to go up there and talk to them and say, have you ever heard of the rosary? I mean, there's a Christian way to do this. You don't have to just immediately default to, Eastern mysticism. But they will also talk about, not necessarily in that context, but they'll talk about other things, you know, that are kind of these self-help efforts to better yourself. And they've always scrubbed all of the Christianity out of it, which is very sad. But our habits do become our virtues, and they can also become our vices. And again, that's another word that we don't hear a lot anymore in the world around us, is talks about vices. So if your friends and you found yourselves suddenly at this wedding feast in Matthew 22, would any of you be cast out? And if that's possible, I might be the one bound and cast out, or my friend might. It gives you the opportunity to kind of search your own soul, or to maybe reach out to your friend, if you're a true friend, and talk to them about, maybe some hard truths, about how to maybe you two can get together and do something differently than what you're kind of falling into doing more and more often as you go through your friendship. Yeah, because as Matthew Kelly says, because we are, to one extent or another, who our friends are. So yesterday was the feast day of Saint Alarid. And I didn't know that until I looked him up right before. I've been hearing a little bit about St. Alarid, probably because yesterday was his feast. But the funny thing is that he is somebody that John Cuddeback writes about quite a bit, because St. Alarid was the patron saint of friendship. And he was a very innovative head of a monastery in Britain in the 1100s or in the 12th century. And he said that in many ways our friendships are preparing us for eternity, and not just the way a lot of people see friendships on the face of the earth is to get through the day or the week or have fun or pleasure or whatever. It's not just a waste of time. Friendships were created for, friendships. Like I said, we're a herding species. But what we find is that sometimes our friends are not really our friends, they are acquaintances. And what I tell my wife and I tell the girls that, really, I think our experience, and I think most people's experience in life, is that you have a small handful of really close friends, and those can change over time. So you might have had a few close friends in high school or grade school, different in college, different in adult life, different after you got married. I assume that I'll have maybe some different friends after our kids all leave the house. I'll have different friends maybe when we have grandchildren. All those things, you change your friends. And sometimes you have one friend that exists all the way through that, which I think is an extremely rare gift, but it's something to treasure. And just like Sirach says, there's nothing so precious as a faithful friend. That's a big thought to have in Scripture. So the art is to find your true friends. So Dr. Cuddeback says the art of finding true friendship. It may be one or two guys at any given point in your life. It should be probably your spouse throughout your entire marriage, right? So we have to avoid collecting and hoarding friends as though they're a Beanie Baby collection, because you can't devote the energy and the time to nurture a friendship with 35 people. You're going to end up with no true friends. You're going to end up with 35 acquaintances and at least 25 who are annoyed with you because you're distant or you're not there for them when they need you. And so you need to invest in that friendship in a way that nurtures the friendship. You're there when they need you. You are dependable, you're reliable, you're loyal, you're faithful, as in Sirach says. And of course, the first and foremost is our spouse, but as men, we need other men as our friends. We can't just have our spouse as our friend because men and women are different, right? You got different wiring, and it's a wonderful difference that is something to certainly treasure. But if we don't have other men in our lives that are calling us to a higher level, and maybe some men in our lives who we are their calling to a higher level, then it can leave us with some emptiness and this despair and loneliness that seems to be infecting a lot of men in the country. I have a person who's not a friend. He's a relative, a distant relative, but he is obviously suffering from the fact that he doesn't have any friends. And he's a great guy. I really like this guy. He's a very good relative. He's got a good heart. He's a hard worker. He is loyal to his family. He's got a lot of good characteristics and traits, but he travels about 6 days a week. And because he travels 6 days a week, he has nobody where he lives that he can talk to and hang out with. And thank God they just got involved with the church where they live for the first time in their entire marriage. And his wife was just telling us at the holidays that she was blown away by the fact that he said, "Yeah, we can go to church with these guys." So they met an older couple who said, "Hey, you guys have a church?" No, their kids aren't even baptized. And so his wife said, I think we should go to church with this couple, and I think it's a Baptist church, and I think that could really change my friend's life because he'll, maybe for the first time have people where he lives that he can associate with, get invited over to do things, experience a little bit of life with, and hopefully, because it's a Christian faith, be based in Christianity. So. But we need that as men, and the crisis in the church, I think, is that more and more men don't have other men, even in their own parish, that they even know their first name. And so that's a real problem. But we have to avoid collecting and hoarding friends like there's some sort of a collection, and because we need to devote ourselves to that friendship. So St. Alarid, one of the things that he wrote a book on friendship back in the 1100s, and he said that true friends are always hard to find, and so there's a way to do that and approach it. But one way I think that we can do that, and we can encourage other men to do that, is to learn a little bit more about St. Alarid. And a word of warning, the LGBT has adopted him as their patron saint of homosexual relationships. So you'll probably see some of that garbage, but it's, definitely invented. But you stick with the Orthodox stuff, maybe John Cuddeback stuff, and you'll see that he can be a great patron saint for friendships. So some recommended steps that I kind of gleaned from Cuddeback and other sources coming in today is to certainly pray for deeper and richer friendships. You need to put yourself in circumstances where you're going to meet men who are also working out their salvation. So you want to look for good opportunities. If you simply just go to anything and everything, you aren't probably fishing in the right pond, right? So just like when you were looking for your spouse, most of us found our spouses in at least neutral, if not good situations. typically not at the bar on a Saturday night after the Husker football game. So there's a way to go about that, but you put yourself in situations where you're going to meet other guys, like retreats, like parish activities, things like that, parish clubs and groups. You might need to, we certainly need to be patient with yourself and others. So when you take your steps at elevating your game and the way that you hold yourself and in the way that you present yourself, you don't want to go over the top because people think you've flipped, right? You're just like, his plate shifted. This guy's nuts. But you go at it slowly and patiently. So maybe the first time you go to mass after getting your new suit, you just wear a button-down shirt with no tie, right? Or maybe you just wear the tie, no jacket. Ease it in there. But so be patient with yourself, and also be patient with others, because you don't want to pick out like that guy in the parish, like, this guy's great. I mean, he's got it all together, and all of a sudden he's got a protection order against you because he thinks you're stalking him, right? So, bad situation. Don't do that. But be patient and just put yourself in that situation to develop that relationship. That good relationships take time to develop, right? They aren't going to happen overnight. So you're patient with yourself and others. Be willing to befriend other men who are also on the same path as you. So it might be somebody that's you like, he's right where I am. He'd be a good buddy. We both kind of move forward together. Or it might be somebody that you feel like could be a good mentor to you. Or it might be somebody that's, kind of maybe struggling a little bit, and you're like, hey, I've been there. I've had those troubles, and why don't we go out and grab a beer and talk about it? You can be that mentor to that person too, and those things can develop into great friendships and relationships as well. But you could take Saint Alaret as one of your patron saints, and maybe read Cuddeback's book, right? So you'd get this book on friendship by Cuddeback and pick that out. Might be a future book club book, Nick. I don't know. We'll see. All right. So a few takeaway questions for you guys to kind of think about are these. There's 4 of them. So 1, are you presenting yourself to others as someone who is worthy of friendship? Right? So are you dressing, speaking, behaving, engaging in things that would draw other men to you in a good way? The second consideration is, are you choosing your friends based on your modesty, your virtues, your character, and theirs? Or are these all circumstantial? What I mean by that is, are your friends because that's your wife's friends group, or because it's the place that you work? I mean, are you just basically taking whatever friends want to come your way? Or are you actually actively and intentionally seeking out friendships that draw you closer to God? And that's kind of another Matthew Kelly tip. If your friends aren't drawing you closer to God, it's time to move on and get different friends. And the easiest way to allow that to happen in your life is to not intentionally and actively seek out good friendships. It's kind of like the faith. A lot of us Christians, actually everybody in the world, I'd say 85% of the entire face of the earth is what they are because that's what their parents were. So they're Muslim because their parents were Muslim. They're Jewish because their parents were Jewish. They're Christian because their parents were Christian. Only a fraction of us are what we are because we've actually looked into it and intellectually discerned it as the truth, as opposed to these other teachings out there. The same thing happens with our friendships. We are friends with this person because we went to school with them, or they play on our intramural or our town league basketball team, or we see them at the bar frequently and we just sat next to them a few times and, oh my gosh, they're a Yankee fan too, right? So we develop our friendships that way, which can develop into awesome friendships. There's no question about it. But if we're just circumstantially falling into these things, I think we can be a lot more proactive about it and actually seek out better friends. The third one is maybe pick a few new friends and let some other friendships pass away. So it might be time to not nurture this friendship that isn't bringing you closer to God. This guy is engaging in some things that are detrimental to your spiritual health, or at least not doing anything that's supplementing your spiritual health. So this isn't a healthy relationship, and he doesn't seem to be receptive to your path of salvation, your path of holiness as well. So it's just like, this guy likes to just hang around and drink. Nothing good comes of it. I think I probably need to look for a new friend. But how do you do that without hurting him? How do you do that without scandalizing him because you're a Christian and you didn't want to hang around with the pagan anymore, and so now he's more hateful and less likely to come to Christ eventually? There's you got to be calculated in doing that. You can't just pick up the phone and say, you're a pagan, I'm never going to hang out with you again and hang out. That's not a Christian way to do it. Don't do that. Fourth is, what can you do in your life to elevate your game so that other good men around you might consider you a friend, or at least an example to fashion their lives after? So I don't know how to boil those four down into easy terms, but I suppose, one, are you acting like somebody that's worthy of friendship? Two, are you actually out there actively and intentionally choosing your friends? Three, have you assessed your current friendships and decided who might be dragging you down and who's elevating you? And then four, what can you do to up your game? So that's the dovetail of the talk, and that external appearances, we start with those, but we have to look deeper. And there's a man crisis, and friendships and these external appearances and deep things within us can really create meaningful and holy relationships going forward. So there you go. Thank you very much for your time.